Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss best practice and a comment that someone made to me on how there'd been a change from achieving best practice to complying with standards. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, the comment that someone made to me was that they had noticed over time a shifting away from people doing audits by following best practice. And of course, best practice represents the opinion of one auditor against the opinion of another auditor to compliance with standards. And the person observed that auditors in the good old days used to boast that they exceeded standards and followed best practice. And of course, nobody else did, or at least that was the theory. And to provide an answer, the first thing I'm going to do is give somewhat of an oversimplified theory. But if we go back to the 1920s and before, for instance, at that time, an auditor was not required to do any work at all on the existence of inventory, any work at all on the existence or valuation of accounts receivable, and basically the auditor audited financial statements in an audit opinion. Basically, oh, let me exaggerate, said you'd not done not much more than prepared the financial statements from the books. And of course, there were a series of spectacular frauds and subsequent lawsuits that changed all that, particularly with respect to accounts receivable and inventory. If we go back to Over and Gurney and Company in 1866 in the United Kingdom, which was a huge fraud, it resulted on a run on the Bank of England. It was a huge disaster, economic disaster for the country. And the result of that was in the year 1900 that the UK required audits of all companies, figuring that that would prevent fraud. In the United States, McKesson and Robbins, the swindle in 1938, the judge found it a little astonishing that absolutely no work had been done to determine whether there was any inventory or not, and there wasn't. And there'd been no work done to determine whether receivables existed, and they didn't, or were correctly valued, and they weren't. And that resulted a little while later in standards requiring work on existence of inventory and work on existence and valuation of accounts receivable. So again, to simplify too much, where we then ended up in the 1980s was we had standards and best practice. And standards, perhaps I'm making this up, covered half of what practitioners as a group, auditors as a group might argue was the best way to do an audit. And for instance, the risk model was around in the 1980s. In Canada, it was contained in about 3 or 4 sentences in the handbook, so it really wasn't well explained. There were probably a lot of people that didn't even know it was there because it was perhaps hidden a little, so it wasn't well explained. The big 8 firms had all figured it out and were all using their own version of the risk model, which in the very big picture, they all understood it the same way. But you had a couple or 3 firms that used extensively statistical sampling, whereas other firms were very judgmental firms. But in the big picture, they were all doing the same thing, and they would all have individually argued that they were following best practice. After that, internationally, there started to be a process of codifying best practice. First, what happened was things that were simple and everyone agreed upon were done, and then slowly moved on to the more complicated sections. In 2005, many people say to me that's when the risk model was added to professional standards. In Canada, I say it was there in 1986 and even before, but a lot of people hadn't noticed it because it perhaps wasn't as clear as it became in 2005. So that's when the quote-unquote risk model was quote-unquote added. And then in 2009, internationally, we had the Clarity Project, which took all the existing standards and rewrote them in a more clear format. And if you take the 2005 standard and the 2009 standard and run them through some kind of grammar program to see the reading level, you will find that more or less they resulted in much clearer standards in 2009. And so that was a good thing. So the result is now that best practice and standards are pretty much in the same place. I would be hard pressed to argue that best practice exceeded standards in any way, basically because standards are now really very, very complete. The result, of course, is there's been a major focus on documentation. Not much has changed in procedures other than we are to apply them to all assertions. But, analysis, inquiry, confirmation, computation, the 6 audit procedures, they've been around for many, many years, and we haven't really found a new procedure. We just are documenting much more completely that, in fact, we've done those procedures, and the procedures have been done appropriately. So once where you needed to exceed standards, it was very clear that you had to go past what was required by standards to achieve best practice. Now I would argue that best practice and standards are converged. And what is now important is the efficiency and effectiveness with which you follow the standards. There's many ways of doing it, and some people do it in what I would say is a very inefficient and ineffective method, but they achieve compliance with the standards, so you can't say that they've done a bad audit. Their audit's just fine. It was just inefficient and ineffective. So, thanks for listening.